The Deathbirds of Elden Ring represent a fascinating chapter in the history of the lands between. They were once the overseers of funerary rites in a time before the Erd Tree. Thus through them we can get a glimpse of what this world was like before it was dominated by the Erd Tree and death became stagnant. To me, the most interesting facet of the practices associated with these sinister birds is that they were developed in a world absent the Erd Tree, before the Erd Tree was around. And for the player, this should immediately be intriguing, as the lands between we actually get to explore is so dominated by the Erd Tree, both physically and culturally. And we learn that these death rites were developed outside the Erd Tree's purview before its arrival from the explosive Ghostflame spell, which reads as following: Sorcery of the Servants of Death. In the time when there was no Erd Tree, death was burned in Ghostflame. Deathbirds were the keepers of that flame. As I discussed in my Erd Tree lore video, clearly there was a period of time when cultures and society developed and existed outside of the dominion of the Erd Tree, and given its function in regards to the processes of death, it makes sense that prior mechanisms and funerary rites needed to exist. I argue in that same video that there was a period of history between the reign of the ancient dragons and Queen Marika's reign, in which there was no Elden Lords that we know of, and there must have been some sort of power vacuum, unlike what we see in the current Erd Tree era, where everything is culturally dominated by the Erd Tree itself. As such, in this period, it seems as though there was an outer god that was able to spread, and its rites, its death rites, would become the dominant funerary rite of the world at this era. I'm of course referring to the outer god that is linked to what we know as the Twin Bird, a being we learn of via the Twin Bird kite shield, which reads as follows: Shield featuring a vividly painted twin bird. The Twin Bird is said to be the envoy of an outer god, and mother of the Deathbirds. This is the only direct mention we get of this Twin Bird and its associated outer god. Yet that being said, this small piece of evidence actually gives us a lot to work with and chew over. First of all, it directly links the Deathbirds and their rites to an outer god, as well as placing the creation of these Deathbirds at the feet of this Twin Bird, an envoy to that greater god. Now, this Twin Bird is described as an envoy, and an envoy is of course a messenger, meaning this bird was a messenger or representative of this outer god. As Vati says in his great video on the death-related bosses, the image we get of this Twin Bird is indeed very reminiscent of the mythological phoenix. The phoenix is of course a bird heavily associated with death, through its endless cycle of death and rebirth. However, I think we can also learn a little bit more from the appearance of this bird, as it is known as the Twin Bird, and we can see from the shield that this title is reflective of their actual or presented appearance. Two heads and two halves of a body, both represented with different colours. If I was to guess what this is representing, I would hazard that one half is meant to represent life, and one half is meant to represent death, symbolising its remit over the cycle of life and death. In Crunchy's Helfin lore video, in his pinned comment, he makes an interesting supplementary point to the video content. He states the following in that comment: The Twin Bird kite shield depicts a black bird against a red background, and a red bird against a blue background. If the black bird is somehow represented or manifested by the Deathbirds, it begs the question what the red bird is. In alchemical symbolism, this would represent the raven and the phoenix, symbolising kind of physical death and release into the spiritual world, whether literal or metaphorical. I agree with Crunchy that these halves are different facets of the one whole, and that the death half is most certainly manifested by her raven, Deathbird children, though this does leave us curious about the potential children of her other half, or whether it is actually also represented by the Deathbirds and we are just missing some of the greater picture. We don't know much about the outer god that's connected to this Twin Bird, but as with all outer gods that we know of quote unquote in the game, we have to assume that their actions of their followers and their servants, in this case the Deathbirds, must be representative of their ideals and their remit, so to speak. And at this point I'd like to shout out another great lore video, and it's Mr. Holthen. In his lore video on the outer god of the Deathbirds, which I will link below, Mr. Holthen suggests that the outer god of the Deathbirds is one of death and of battle. The reason he does this is he thinks that there is a link between certain items that suggests that this outer god rewards those who die in battle. The first item that he points to in order to prove this theory is the blue-feathered branch sword, an item that we'll see later is closely associated with the Deathbirds, and is an item that is dropped by them, in fact, and its description reads as follows. The heart sings when one draws close to death, and thus does one cling so tenaciously to life, to render up a death worth offering. And this similar idea is also reflected in the red-feathered branch sword, which reads as follows. The heart sings when one draws close to death, and a glorious end awaits those who cling so tenaciously to life. As Mr. Holthen states, it suggests that those who cling so desperately onto their life, who fight for their life, are to be rewarded in death. And indeed, this idea of people being rewarded for being great heroes is something that's also reflected in Erdtree traditions, for we find many great hero ashes who seem to have been granted an Erdtree burial as an honour for their actions in life. And this repeated theme and this repeated idea seems to give water to what Mr. Holthen is suggesting here, that this outer god is possibly one of death and of battle that rewards warriors after life. Mr. Holthen then also links it to the Helfin Steeple Sword, something I will cover later in this video for other reasons, but in short, Mr. Holthen repeats the idea that is said on the Helfin Steeple item description that shows that those who have died a warrior's death will be guided by the Helfin in the spirit world, i.e. being rewarded for their heroics and battle prowess. It's a really great video and actually one of the best explanations or theories on what the outer god of the Deathbirds could represent. So I'll link that video below and highly recommend you check Mr. Holthen out and give them a sub. But moving on from the outer god and back to the Deathbirds themselves, I want to talk about their symbolism, their appearance as ravens or crows. As is always the case with FromSoftware, nothing is really done or selected by chance, and neither is choosing to make this branch of Death Custodians to have a crow or raven form, as birds crop up throughout history and cultures as a symbol or messenger of death, and no birds are more associated with death than the crow or the raven. To many people, internally, they already associate ravens and crows with death, and the reason this is the case is because they are carrion eaters. No doubt on the battlefields throughout history, these birds would have been a common sight among the dead, and thus where there was death, there would be crows. I will soon discuss the idea of psychopomps, spirits who guide and shepherd the dead, a common theme in Elden Ring as far as I see it, and birds and crows are quite often seen as psychopomps, which is why many believed they gathered near where the dead were, that these birds were getting ready to guide them, and ultimately this is what the Deathbirds actually do in game. They gather the dead and do guide them to the other side. And they fall into the category for me of death shepherds or ushers. They are just one of many, and we will discuss the rest soon. And while the crow or the raven might be closely associated for death with us in the real world, for those in the lands between, it was the Deathbirds that were closely associated with death, synonymous with it indeed. Indeed, we will see that the association of death and these birds is so deeply ingrained within the culture of lands between society, leading to people taking the form of the bird to represent death in many instances. And to me, that death is so synonymous with these birds suggests that maybe they were one of the first representations or first manifestations of death in the lands between. Indeed, the fact that we can face so many in the game spread throughout the map shows how important the spread of this cult really was. One great bit of lore that helps exemplify how important they are to Erdtree society in regards to death comes from the Hidden Plumage item description, a cut content crafting material from the game, which reads as follows. Death's bearers were once said to have taken the form of birds, symbolised by these black feathers. But this does indeed carry over into their lore, and to what their role actually is. They were the shepherds of death, overseers of an ancient funerary practice, who presided over the burning of the dead within ghost flames. And so now let's take a look at these funerary practices themselves, the Ghostflame and Necromancy. We learn of these practices via the instruments that they wield, the Death's Poker, the description of which reads as follows. The birds are graveyard fire keepers. It is said they rake out the ashen remains of the dead from their kilns. These birds are the overseers as something known as the graveyard fires. Now, being someone who pays close attention to semantics in these games, this sentence is of great interest to me. First of all, graveyards. Now, graveyards are not necessary in Erdtree society, for we have the catacombs, as burial is not done in the ground as we would traditionally see it in the real world, for example, but in fact the dead are taken to the catacombs to have an Erdtree burial, to be reabsorbed by the great tree roots. So what are the graveyards that we see everywhere in game? Well, given what we've just heard in this item description, I would suggest that most of the graveyards we see in game, such as in Liurnia, Limgrave, and the mountaintops of the giants, are leftovers from this death rite practice that was once overseen by the Deathbirds. And it wouldn't be the first example of us seeing the remains of other ancient civilizations and cultures strewn about the lands between, built around by the new Erdtree society. This item description also suggests that in these graveyards there were great fires or kilns in which the dead were burned before their ashen remains were scraped out by these pokers. Fire pokers, of course, are actual instruments used for clearing out ash and moving around coals, etc. in a fire. Now, the burning of the dead is of course a very common practice throughout real-world history, such as in ancient Greek society, ancient Rome, and Hinduism, just to name a few. However, to my own experiences and cultural background, it specifically reminds me of Western Protestant crematorium funerals, of which I have personally attended one. For those unfamiliar with these practices, the deceased are placed into a coffin. The coffin is then placed into a kiln, before the ashes are then retrieved, and typically placed into an urn. And then optionally, those ashes can be buried, or kept by the family. So quite clearly, that is the role in which these Deathbirds play, overseeing the funerary rites of a sort of crematorium practice. And specifically, the dead are burned within something known as the ghost flames. And this is told to us by the Rancor Pot item description, which reads as follows. In times of old, the dead were burned with ghost flame, and from those cinders arose vengeful spirits. The ghost flame is a curious phenomena, because while the Deathbirds did use it to burn the dead, it also seems to have been produced from the dead themselves. This is something we learn from the story of the Fallen Hawks, the zombie-like expedition that found themselves trapped underground and desperate, and in their desperation, they took to burning the bones of their fellows and produced the ghost flame. And this is something we can learn of via the ghost flame torch, which reads as follows. Metal torch that burns with cold ghost flame, tool of the fallen hawks who prowl the underground rivers. When the band's last embers were used up in their long search, they began to burn the bones of their fellows, acquiring the cold ghost flame, but sealing their fate as dwellers of the underground for all eternity. So it appears as though burning bones produces this ghost flame, but it isn't as simple as that. It seems as though burning the bones of the dead produces the ghost flame because it is intrinsically linked to the dead and the spirits within. And I say this of course because we also see the ghost flame in another circumstance, when those who live in death are resurrecting, something pointed out by Crunchy in his Helfin lore video. Now, we do have a fairly tentative way of explaining why the ghost flame appears at this point of resurrection, because it seems that ghost flames are also tied to vengeful or strong spirits, as seen in ancient Death Rancor, where it is implied that from these ashes can be found vengeful spirits, and I would suggest that the ghost flame appearing around the bones of a resurrecting undead is symbolic of their vengeful spirit once again inhabiting their form and refusing to dissipate entirely. This idea of those who live in death being a life form that is in essence a spirit that refuses to die, is something that can be backed up with a translation. And once again I turn to fellow content creator Last Protagonist, who's provided a fascinating translation of one of Rogier's dialogues. In the English, Rogier says the following: "You may find this peculiar, but I've discovered something in my examination of the Knight of the Black Knives. These souls have committed no offence. They have every right to life, only they happened to touch upon a flaw in the order." However, according to Last Protagonist's own translation of the Japanese, he reads it in a slightly different way. "You probably think I'm strange, but I'm in the middle of researching the night of the plot. They haven't made any transgressions, just living determinedly, and because of that, they've run into a flaw of the order. Living determinedly, i.e. wanting to live so much, to keep themselves alive so much, that they in essence refuse to die." And thematically this ties into something I've looked at already, the blue and red feathered branch sword talismans, which introduced the idea of people holding on so tenaciously to life. And again, the repeated thematics seems to give some weight to this translation by Last Protagonist. And this determination to live, to me, well explains the manifestation of the ghost flame and the resurrection of those who live in death. They simply refuse to die. They are living determinedly. The point being is that the ghost flame is a little bit more complex than it first appears to be. It isn't just a flame from the bones of the dead, it is intrinsically linked to the dead and their spirits. I think this idea is further backed up by the curious grave violet item description, which had me perplexed for a long time before I had pondered these very questions. Its description reads as follows: "A purple flower that blooms in graveyards. Material used for crafting items. The hue of ghost flame. It's believed to be useful in calling forth spirits." Now, the grave violet is of course used in one recipe, the Rancor pot, and so is a material that produces spirit fire, or ghost flame. Now, what follows is of course my own speculation, but I believe the fact that this plant specifically grows in graveyards means that its growth must be connected to the dead and or their spirits. The fact the flower itself can be used to summon ghost flame and the associated Rancor spirits, to me suggests a sort of cycle, that these flowers are directly connected to the dead. They have grown from the dead, whose spirits are in turn connected to the ghost flame, and thus these flowers, these grave violets, are infused with the same power. The ghost flame isn't just born from burning the bones. It is an element, a metaphysical element, intrinsically linked to the dead and their bodies, which is why we can get the ghost flame from the bones of the dead, or this flower, which has grown from those areas in which the dead are also located. The understanding that the ghost flame is an intrinsic part of the spirit and the dead, rather than just a practice or magic of the Deathbirds, is essentially an understanding how it is also associated with other death practices, and I find the grave violet to be a cornerstone in that understanding. But more on those other connections later, just bear it in mind for now. Now, returning to the idea that the Deathbirds are able to summon vengeful spirits through the Rancor, this does seem to fit into the logic of the world, given that we know the dead can be controlled and summoned via ash. In the case of the Deathbirds, these vengeful spirits, these Rancor, can be summoned or found within the ash raked from the fires of the Deathbirds, and this is something we learn from ancient Death Rancor, which reads as follows: "Summons a horde of vengeful spirits that chase down foes. They are cinders of the ancient Death Hex, raked from the fires of Ghostflame by Deathbirds." Now, this is very similar to our ability to use the Spirit Calling Bell to summon forth spirit from the ash, and yet the Rancor spell suggests that the Deathrite birds were able to manipulate spirits in a more primitive degree, recreating a vengeful facet of the deceased, rather than a one-to-one creation of the spirit, like the Spirit Calling Bell can. They draw upon this exact aspect of the dead, the vengeful aspect, and they fire forth a one-tone version of the spirits within the ash. Is it possible the more sophisticated version of Spirit Calling, via the Spirit Calling Bell, was developed by building off the practices of these death rite birds, the practice of summoning vengeful spirits. I certainly think this is plausible, as both practices do directly draw upon an aspect of the spirit from the ashes of the dead. The idea of deathbirds harnessing the power of spirits is further augmented by our understanding of the augmented wings that we see on upgraded deathbirds, known as deathrite birds in the game. These versions of the deathbirds have huge magical wings in which sit a number of ghostly people. It turns out that deathbirds would have been supported in their death rites by certain priests, and this is something we learn via the deathrite spear, which reads as follows. The priests became guardians of the birds through the rite of death, which also serves as an oath sworn to their distant resurrection. Now, this is a really interesting idea of dying so you can be revived in the future, and is something we will come back to when we visit the mausoleum and the soulless demigods. But in general, it seems as though, collectively, the practice overseen by the birds and their priests were known as the rite of death, the death rites, hence the death rite birds. I find it interesting that there were clearly humans involved, priests that served the manifestation of an outer god, the Deathbirds, and perhaps these priests were priests to that outer god itself, the outer god that we discussed earlier in this video, and no doubt the priests venerated the Deathbirds and their twin bird mother as well. These priests wielded these staffs and made an oath to become the guardians of these deathrite birds in exchange for future resurrection, being dead now and being brought to life in the future. And as most will be aware, these are the priests that are visible in the wings of the deathrite birds, the upgraded versions of the Deathbirds. And it appears as though this is how they act as guardians, as the presence of these wings and the presence of these priests do grant the Deathbirds, the deathrite birds, far more power than their lesser kin. To me, the deathrite priests, present as ghostly visages in the wings of the deathrite birds, are channeling their powers, granting the Deathbirds their enhanced powers, and this is evidenced by the ghostly glow present on these models that is not present on the regular Deathbirds. And for those who ask me to explain why these Deathbirds are so difficult to kill, there's your answer. The deathrite priests in the wings of these powered up Deathbirds are granting them all those horrendous powers. So these priests are the reason why the Deathbirds are so traumatic to fight. Now, the deathrite priests are interesting to me because I've suggested that they channel the power of the Deathbirds. And now I want to segue into a subject that deals with another human trying to resurrect and channel these powers for their own ends. I'm now going to talk about the subject of necromancy and the necromancer Garrus that we meet in-game. Let's try and unpack this lore by first of all looking at Garrus himself. He is wearing the Sage's set, tying up with the name of the cave, the Sage's Cave, that we find him in. This set reads as follows: thick burgundy robe, attire of the wise sages who were deemed heretical, evidence that the wearer was driven from town. I discussed this in my Millennia lore video, but we do meet another sage-wearing person in-game, Sage Gowry. In that video, I argued that the town that Gowry was driven from, as is mentioned in the Sage set, was in fact Celia. Not only was he located near Celia, but is also very intimate with the secrets of the town and its sorceries, which themselves are secret. However, Gowry has become an adherent of Rot and its incantations, which he can teach to you, and I conclude that it is these interests and veneration of the Rot in general that have had him driven from his former town. Now, I don't necessarily conclude that Garrus is also from Celia. However, I would suggest that he has suffered a similar and parallel fate, that he was once a sage of some order, only to be expelled for his heretical magics. Yet for Garrus, these heretical magics were necromancy, not rot, and this no doubt led to his expulsion from whatever town and order he was a part of before. His motivations for doing so, for studying a heretical sorcery, is quite clear to us, as we can learn his motivations via the weapon he wields, the family head's flail, and that item reads as follows: 3 bludgeoning copper heads attached to a handle by chains. Signature weapon of Necromancer Garrus, the heretical sage. The heads were made to resemble those of his wife and 2 children. So for those familiar with Dark Souls 1 and its story, may find this story extremely familiar to that of the Pinwheel, a necromancer who stole some of the power of Nito the Gravelord in order to resurrect his wife and child. Here Garrus's aims can definitely be interpreted as similar, for what else could a man who is already mourning his wife and 2 children want with necromancy? Clearly, he only has one goal in mind: the resurrection of his lost family. Now, as to why I have included necromancy in this particular section, is because the branch of necromancy we encounter in Elden Ring appears to be an offshoot of the sorceries of the death rite, of the Deathbirds. For example, we can tie the idea of rancor and controlling and guiding these vengeful spirits as something linked to the death rites and the Deathbirds. And in fact, it is the ancient death rancor which helps ties us together. And I know I've already read it, but I will read it again just for the purposes of this section. Summons a horde of vengeful spirits that chase down foes. They are the cinders of the ancient death hex, raked from the fires of Ghostflame by Deathbirds. This now appears to be an ancient art that has been resurrected and revived by the necromancer Garrus, for the Rancorol spell reads as follows: Sorcery of the Servants of Death, summons vengeful spirits that chase down foes. Once thought lost, this ancient death hex was rediscovered by the necromancer Garrus. So this is an interesting bit of lore for a number of reasons. Firstly, it appeals to my obsessive need to understand and place the Elden Ring timeline. It uses the term ancient, indicating to us that the time of the Deathbirds and their associated practices happened a long time ago, as well as the fact that it was a long time ago when the world was absent the Erd Tree. Secondly, it also links this branch of necromancy to the death rites, but unlike the death rites, the necromancer Garrus is not as interested in the whole rites as a whole as a religious practice, but is instead interested in the ability to control the spirits from the ash of the long dead, and his need to somehow control and recreate the spirits of his lost family. And this motivation and objective seems to have been achieved to some degree, and this is backed up by the skill found on Garrus's weapon, called Familial Rancor, and the description of that skill reads as follows: Gently rattle the copperheads to summon vengeful spirits that chase down foes. The anguish of a spouse and children invites accursed wrath. Given the description of this skill and the description of the Rancorol spell, I conclude that Garrus has looked in and researched the spells of the death rite to harness the spirits of his long dead family, and in a way he has succeeded. But as we have already discussed, the death rites and their control of rancor only provides a primitive aspect of the deceased spirit. It isn't a one-to-one recreation, it only draws upon their vengeance. And while Garrus has managed to resurrect his family in a sense, I can hardly believe this pale and tortured imitation was his end goal, and thus I see Garrus's story as another one of tragedy, something far too common in Elden Ring. So while what we learn of the Deathrite birds may be threadbare, their legacy is far more prominent, as these birds essentially become symbolic and synonymous with death. We see this on the attire of the Ravenmount assassins, including their cloak, which reads as follows: A ritual implement for transforming into a deathbird, if only by imitation. We are the birds of prey, bringers of death. These assassins want to represent themselves as the bringers of death, to strike fear into those who would cross them, and to give weight to their promise as assassins. And thus they have taken the raven appearance of the Deathbirds. But not only that, they attempt to mimic their movements by diving on their opponents from above, as we learn via their raptor talon weapons. And this is all because the assassins want to appear as death themselves, and to this world, there is no clearer indication of death than the Deathbirds. it becomes clear that in the world of Elden Ring, the most recognisable symbol of death is the Deathbird, as it might be the skull for us in real life. And this really speaks to the cultural importance that these Deathbirds once held. They were death in a world before the Erd Tree, and even now, people take their symbol as the symbol of death. But ultimately, the Deathbirds aren't just death themselves, they were shepherds of the dead, guiding the Deathrite priests in burning of the dead and controlling and shepherding the vengeful spirits found within the ash. Thank you so much for watching this short Elden Ring lore video. This lore video is a segment from a much larger and longer video on my main channel, and a link to the full video can be found in the description. If you are interested in more Elden Ring lore content, then be sure to subscribe here and on my main channel Smowtown. But until next time, I will see you in the lands between.